Hello, and welcome to the Street Crime America's YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Joseph Anthony Colombo. Joseph Anthony Colombo Sr. was born June 16, 1923, and was the boss of the Colombo crime family, one of the 5 families of the American Mafia in New York City. Mr. Colombo was born in New York City, where his father was an early member of what was then the Profaci crime family. In 1961, the first Colombo War unfolded, instigated by the kidnapping of 4 high-ranking members in the Profaci family by Joe Gallo. Later that year, Mr. Gallo was imprisoned, and in 1962, family leader Joe Profaci died of cancer. In 1963, the Bonanno crime family boss, Joseph Bonanno, made plans with Joseph Magliocco to assassinate several rivals in the commission. When Mr. Magliocco gave the contract to one of his top hitmen, Mr. Colombo revealed the plot to its targets. As a reward for turning on his boss, Mr. Colombo was awarded the Profaci family. Mr. Colombo's only jail term would come in 1966, when Mr. Colombo was sentenced to 30 days in jail for contempt by refusing to answer questions from a grand jury about his financial affairs. In 1970, he created the Italian-American Civil Rights League. Later that year, the first Italian Unity Day rally was held in Columbus Circle to protest the federal persecution of all Italians everywhere. In 1971, Mr. Gallo was released from prison, and Mr. Colombo invited him to a peace meeting with an offering of $1,000, to which Mr. Gallo refused, instigating the Second Colombo War. On June 28, 1971, Mr. Colombo was shot 3 times by Jerome A. Johnson, one being in the head. At the second Italian Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle, sponsored by the Italian-American Civil Rights League, Johnson was immediately killed by Mr. Colombo's bodyguards. But Mr. Colombo was paralysed from the shooting. On May 22, 1978, Mr. Colombo died of cardiac arrest. Joseph Colombo Sr. was born into an Italian-American family on June 16, 1923 in Brooklyn. In 1938, Mr. Colombo was found strangled in a car with his mistress. Joe Colombo attended New Utrecht High School in Brooklyn for 2 years, and then dropped out to join the US Coast Guard. In 1945, Mr. Colombo was diagnosed with neurosis and discharged from the service. Mr. Colombo's legitimate jobs included 10 years as a longshoreman and 6 years as a salesman for a meat company. Mr. Colombo's final job was that of a real estate salesman. Mr. Colombo owned a modest home in Dyker Heights, Brooklyn, and a 5-acre estate in Blooming Grove, New York. Mr. Colombo followed his father into the Profaci family. Mr. Colombo became one of the family's top enforcers and soon became a capo. On February 27, 1961, the Gallos kidnapped 4 of Mr. Profaci's top men: underboss Mr. Magliocco, Frank Profaci, who was Joe Profaci's brother, capo Salvatore Musacchia, and soldier John Shimone. Mr. Profaci himself eluded capture and flew to sanctuary in Florida. While holding the hostages, Larry and Albert Gallo sent Joe Gallo to California. The Gallos demanded a more favourable financial scheme for the hostages' release. Mr. Gallo wanted to kill one hostage and demand $100,000 before negotiations, but his brother Larry overruled him. After a few weeks of negotiation, Mr. Profaci made a deal with the Gallos. Mr. Profaci's concierge Charles Desage Lociero negotiated with the Gallos, and all the hostages were peacefully released. However, Mr. Profaci had no intention of honouring this peace agreement. On August 20, 1961, Joseph Profaci ordered the murder of Gallo members Joseph Joe Jelly Joelli and Larry Gallo. Gunmen allegedly murdered Joseph Joelli after inviting him to go fishing. Larry Gallo survived a strangulation attempt in the Sahara Club of East Flatbush by Carmine Persico and Salvatore Sale di Ambrosio after a police officer intervened. The war continued on, resulting in 9 murders and 3 disappearances. With the start of the gang war, the Gallo crew retreated to the dormitory. In late November 1961, Joe Gallo was sentenced to 7 to 14 years in prison for murder. On June 6, 1962, Profaci died and was succeeded by longtime underboss Joseph Magliocco. In 1963, Joseph Bonanno, the head of the Bonanno crime family, made plans to assassinate several rivals on the Mafia Commission. Bosses Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino and Stefano Magaddino, as well as Frank De Simone. Mr. Bonanno sought Mr. Magliocco's support, and Mr. Magliocco readily agreed. Not only was Mr. Bonanno bitter for being denied a seat at the commission, but Mr. Bonanno and Mr. Profaci had been close allies for over 30 years prior to the Profaci's death. Mr. Bonanno's audacious goal was to take over the commission and make Mr. Magliocco his right-hand man. Mr. Magliocco was assigned the task of killing Mr. Lucchese and Gambino, and gave the contract to one of his top hitmen, Mr. Colombo. However, the opportunistic Mr. Colombo revealed the plot to its targets. The other bosses quickly realised that Mr. Magliocco could not have planned this himself. Remembering how close Mr. Bonanno was with Mr. Magliocco, and before him Mr. Profaci, as well as their close ties through marriages, the other bosses concluded that Mr. Bonanno was the real mastermind. The commission summoned Mr. Bonanno and Mr. Magliocco to explain themselves. Fearing for his life, Mr. Bonanno went into hiding in Montreal, leaving Mr. Magliocco to deal with the commission. Badly shaken and in failing health, Mr. Magliocco confessed his role in the plot. The commission spared Mr. Magliocco's life but forced him to retire as Profaci family boss and pay a $50,000 fine. As a reward for turning on his boss, Mr. Colombo was awarded the Profaci family. At the age of 41, Mr. Colombo was one of the youngest crime bosses in the country. He was also the first American-born boss of a New York crime family. When New York police detectives Albert Seidman and later the NYPD chief of detectives called Mr. Colombo in for questioning about the death of one of his soldiers, Mr. Colombo came to the meeting without a lawyer. He told Mr. Seidman, "I am an American citizen, first class. I don't have a badge that makes me an official good guy like you, but I work just as honest for a living." On June the 29th, 1970, 50,000 people attended the first Italian Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle in New York City. In February 1971, Mr. Colombo Jr. was acquitted of the charge after the chief witness in the trial had been arrested on perjury charges. Unlike other mob leaders who shunned the spotlight, Mr. Colombo appeared on television interviews, fundraisers, and speaking engagements for the League. At one point, Mr. Colombo posted bail for 11 jailed JDL members. In the spring of 1971, Paramount Pictures started filming The Godfather with the assistance of Mr. Colombo and the League. Due to its subject matter, the film originally faced great opposition from Italian Americans to filming in New York. However, after producer Albert Ruddy met with Mr. Colombo and agreed to excise the terms Mafia and Cosa Nostra from the film, the League cooperated fully. In early 1971, Joe Gallo was released from prison. As a supposedly apologetic gesture, Mr. Colombo invited Mr. Gallo to a peace meeting with an offering of $1,000. Mr. Gallo refused the invitation, wanting $100,000 to stop the conflict, which Mr. Colombo refused to pay. At that point, acting boss Vincenzo Aloi issued a new order to kill Mr. Gallo. On March 11th, 1971, after being convicted of perjury for lying on his application to become a real estate broker, Mr. Colombo was sentenced to 2.5 years in state prison. On June 28, 1971, Mr. Colombo was shot 3 times by Jerome A. Johnson, with one bullet hitting him in the head. Mr. Colombo was paralysed from the shooting. On August 28, 1971, after 2 months at Roosevelt Hospital in Manhattan, Mr. Colombo was moved to his estate at Bloomberg Grove. In 1976, there were reports that he could recognise people and utter several words. On May 22, 1978, Mr. Colombo died of cardiac arrest at St. Luke's Hospital in New York. Mr. Colombo's funeral was held at St. Bernadette's Catholic Church in Bensonhurst, and he was buried in St. John's Cemetery in the Middle Village section of Queens. Although many in the Mr. Colombo family blamed Joe Gallo for the shooting, the police eventually concluded that Johnson was a lone gunman after they had questioned Mr. Gallo. Since Johnson had spent time a few days earlier at a Gambino club, one theory was that Carlo Gambino organised the shooting. Mr. Colombo refused to listen to Mr. Gambino's complaints about the League, and allegedly spat in Mr. Gambino's face during one argument. However, the Colombo family leadership was convinced that Joe Gallo ordered the murder after his falling out with the family. Mr. Gallo was murdered on April 7, 1972. After the Colombo shooting, Joseph Iacovelli became the acting boss for 1 year before Carmine Persico took over. In popular culture, Mr. Colombo features in the first episode of UK history TV channel's Yesterday's documentary series Mafia's Greatest Hits. In Christopher, an episode of The Sopranos, Silvio Dante claims that Mr. Colombo was the founder of the first Italian-American anti-defamation organization. However, the American-Italian Anti-Defamation League was founded before Mr. Colombo's Italian-American Civil Rights League. In 2015, Joe Colombo's oldest son, Anthony Colombo, authored Colombo, The Unsolved Murder, a biography/memoir with co-author Don Capiera.